Welcome back to Wisdom Teachings. I'm your host, David Wilcock, and in this episode, we have geometry in collision. This is where the original idea of the multidimensional tetrahedral geometry that Richard Hoagland has been talking about ever since Monuments of Mars in 1993, and even before he wrote that book, comes together into a more complex version than just looking at individual vortexes on the sun or on gas planets as bands or individual spots or on solid planets as volcanic activity. Now, we're going to be looking at how different geometries coexist in one planet and how they counter-rotate and how they will give off huge energetic surges as the corners of different geometries, they're called vertices, cross over each other because they have so much energy that it's literally like bringing two electrically charged terminals together and you get this big flash of lightning between the two terminals. Not only am I going to show you two examples of that phenomenon occurring on planets in our solar system, I'm also going to show you how it's happening with our solar system in collision with greater geometry in the formation of these domain walls that we've been talking about, these boundaries of quantized redshift that are crashing into stars at set intervals. We now are going to have proof that our solar system is crashing into some kind of energetic cloud, and NASA finally came clean and gave us the truth about this quietly in 2009. I didn't even catch it until I was doing research for this episode over 10 years after the Russians clearly had the same thing. Now, why is this geometry in collision so important? It's much more than just geometry. It's much more than just interesting patterns in stars and planets. It is literally the ultimate scientific proof of ascension, because this geometry is the key to a whole new multidimensional world. Once we finally get to the point of describing the geometry on Earth, which is several episodes down the road, you're going to see that this geometry is totally the location of all the portals and the natural stargates on Earth. The geometry is the key. That's where you have some kind of multidimensional gateway that opens up, but only at certain times when the geometry comes into the right alignment. And that is a very important point. The geometry has to align itself properly. It's when these nodes overlap each other and intersect that the actual energy surges, and that's when the portals open up. And so you'll hear Corey Goode and others talk about the idea of what he calls the cosmic web. And in some of our episodes, he's talked about how there are certain stopover points when people are using portals and they have to hang out on a planet for a while and wait for the alignment, because until you get the alignment, the Stargate doesn't open. That has to do with very, very large cosmic geometries that are spinning slowly, and there's different ones at the same time, and they come into alignment, and that's when the Stargate opens. So there are places where people have to wait for the portal to appear. It's not always there. But when these portals cross over, that's when you get surges, when you have one geometry and another geometry, and it's all about counter-rotation. Remember, in the gas planets, you have counter-rotating bands of gas. You'll have a band tree and another geometry, and it's all about counter-rotation. Remember, in the gas planets, you have counter-rotating bands of gas. You'll have a band that's all going in one direction and another band that's rotating in completely the opposite direction, and this is extremely common all across the board in the gas planets. They all do this. And in our galaxy, there are certain stars that are brighter, that are rotating in one direction, and then other stars that are redder, that are more in the outer galactic halo, and they rotate in the opposite direction. And I wrote about this in some of my original books, the original Convergence series on my website, divinecosmos.com, where I quote from that study, and it is done by reputable astronomers. It is a fact. It's just that most people don't understand that things are always counter-rotating. And anytime something's rotating, there's a geometry involved. That's the science. A geometric force field is hidden in every level of the universe, from the quantum to the supergalactic. And it's when they cross that all the magic happens. So let's get started. It all goes back to this fluid dynamics, as I've been saying, and that pattern appears in the energy flow of planets, whether it's in their lava or whether it's in their atmosphere, doesn't really matter. The point is these patterns are there and they are very forceful, and you can see it in a single drop of water. The geometry again is the Merkaba, as I've been showing you. It is a vibration that is frozen into geometry when you're in a fluid. That's what you're supposed to be seeing in this classic Richard Hoagland 19.5 diagram of how it appears in planets. To get us started, again, is the great red spot of Jupiter. Now this is important because it shows you very clearly there is a tetrahedron at work in the planet. But at the end of the previous episode, I also showed you this, which is very unambiguous evidence of a dodecahedron working in its atmosphere as well. A very clear, sharp geometric boundary between the cold area inside the pentagon and the hotter areas outside. And all you have to do is just drop on a dodecahedron with no extra Photoshop, no tweaks, and you can clearly see this sucker is perfect. I couldn't believe it. As soon as I saw that, I knew I could do the geometry in my mind. I immediately went over to Photoshop. I got a picture of a dodec, laid it on there, boom, there it was. Now, this is where it gets really, really, really important, because what I'm saying is it's not just tetrahedral geometry in Jupiter. It's this geometry as well. And if Jupiter has counter-rotating gas bands, which we know it does, look in any freshman level astronomy textbook from college and they'll tell you that, then these geometries are going to counter-rotate inside of each other. Now this particular one in the atmosphere may not be doing that. We have to fact check this. But there could be other geometries that are dodecahedral as well that are doing this. So we need further study, but we do know at least that the great red spot rotates with the overall rotation of the planet. The greater rotation is in one direction, the great red spot rotates around, whereas other clouds are rotating in the opposite direction. So somewhere in there, we have a dodecahedral pattern like this, and we have a tetrahedral pattern that is triangular, where there's 3 nodes around the outside. Now take a close look at this diagram once more, and what you're going to see is that there is a pentagon there. And then if you look at the corners of the pentagon and you trace out those lines, you see that there are 5 points along the edge or the equator. Now those 5 points are what I'm really looking at, the corners of the tetrahedron, because remember the model is that they would be counter-rotating. So now let's jump ahead and see what might happen when this dodecahedral geometry crosses over with another geometry working simultaneously, because we have the 3-sided tetrahedron that is crashing in with the pentagonal dodecahedron. So again, here's the tetrahedron, and what if these 2 geometries are counter-rotating, and what happens when the nodes collide? Well, we have the answer already. And it was done in a remarkable study of a mystery that NASA cannot explain. Because what you're seeing in this diagram right here is a very bizarre X-ray pattern that appears at the geometric north of Jupiter. And it sure enough, if you look very carefully at the pink color on the right there, it looks like the top of a pyramid. You can actually see the top of the tetrahedron. You can see a straight line going down to the right, another straight line going down to the left, and another one going down to the back. That's the top of the pyramid. And then there's this really cool blue corona around it of energy. Now that's forming in X-rays, and NASA has no model to explain it, but it's exactly where the top of the tetrahedron making the great red spot would be. Now, NASA unfortunately scrubbed the original article off of the internet, but I had linked to it in my books, and I was able to use archive.org, our old friend, and pull up a saved copy of this very, very important NASA article. Let's take a look. This is actually something I was able to get from the saved article, an illustration of these X-ray patterns. It's pretty wild. Here, I'm going to run it for you. Take a look at this. So what you're seeing now, where you see all this from the saved article, an illustration of these X-ray patterns. It's pretty wild. Here, I'm going to run it for you. Take a look at this. So what you're seeing now, where you see all this green, and again, it's not exactly quite at the North Pole all the time, but the green flashes represent bursts of X-ray energy that are so huge that it's releasing 1 gigawatt of power throughout our solar system. A gigawatt is a tremendously large amount of energy. And I got this animated GIF out of this NASA study that I pulled off of archive.org, puzzling X-rays from Jupiter. Astronomers using the Chandra X-ray Observatory have spotted a mysterious pulsing X-ray beacon near the North Pole of the giant planet March 7th, the day before my birthday, 2002. And we're not going to read this right now because I have it laid out for you, but the key part in the first sentence is that this happens every 45 minutes. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. That's important. It's a repeating phenomenon where you get 45 minutes of nothing, and then boom, this huge energy surge. Let's start reading it now with the bullet points, and you'll get the gist of what's going on. Here's the link, the original link. You can type that into archive.org and it will come up. I pulled mine from, I guess, 2009. Every 45 minutes, a gigawatt pulse of X-rays courses through the solar system. Astronomers are accustomed to such things. Distant pulsars and black holes often bathe the galaxy with blasts of X radiation. But this is not normal. It doesn't come off the North Pole. They've never seen this before. This time, the source isn't exotic and far away. It's right here in our own solar system. The pulses are coming from the North Pole. We weren't surprised to find X-rays coming from Jupiter, he continued. Other observations had done that years ago. The surprise is what Chandra has revealed for the very first time. The location of the beacon surprisingly close to the planet's North Pole and the regular rhythmic way in which it's pulsing. When Gladstone and colleagues trained the Chandra X-ray Observatory on Jupiter, they expected to find the planet's northern X-rays coming from its giant auroral ring. That was the blue ring that we saw. After all, the auroral ring of our own planet is an X-ray source, so Jupiter's would likely be the same. That's not what happened. We used Chandra's high-resolution camera to image the planet during a 10-hour period on December 18, 2000, says Ron Elsner, an X-ray astronomer at the NASA Marshall Space Flight Center who worked with Gladstone. Elsner is describing how they used Chandra's telescope to start to piece together what the heck is going on with these X-ray emissions. Let's continue. They did it for 10 hours, and we hoped it would pinpoint the X-ray source better than earlier satellites had managed. So they knew this was happening, but they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And indeed it did. It greatly exceeded their expectations. And the new image was a surprise. Chandra revealed that most of the X-rays came from a hotspot located very close to Jupiter's north magnetic pole, not from the auroral ring itself. This totally surprised them. Remember, they don't have any models that would explain something happening at the pole. But if the tetrahedral model is right, and it sure as heck looks like it is, and I've showed you how it maps out into quantum physics and galaxies and galactic superclusters and the photon that created the whole universe, yeah, we're gonna expect to see that. So why wouldn't we have a geometric phenomenon exactly at the north or south pole of a planet? Well, we would. It's just that conventional models don't account for this because they don't use hyperdimensional fluid mechanics. But that's what generates this thing, these X-ray bursts. They don't understand why it's coming out of the North Pole. Let's keep reading. Furthermore, this X-ray source was pulsing. That also surprised them. The 45-minute pulsations are very mysterious, adds Elsner, and as an X-ray astronomer, a guy whose whole life is just studying X-rays in space, if he says very mysterious, you know he's not exaggerating. They have no idea what this thing is. They're not perfectly regular like a signal from ET might be. The period drifts back and forth by a few percent. And that's going to be important when we see that I believe this is the result of counter-rotating geometry, and as the nodes cross, it fires something off, because the geometry isn't going to line up exactly the same all the time. Let's keep reading. This is a natural process, he adds. We just don't know what it is. So he's being very honest. There's no explanation for this. NASA just puts it out there, and you got to figure it out for yourself. It's a puzzle. It's a mystery. But I love mysteries. I'm not going to just assume that because other scientists can't figure it out that I can't come up with something. And when you start to see how beautiful this tetrahedron model is, yeah, the first thing I think of is the top of the tetrahedron. Let's keep going. Galileo has also picked up 1 to 200 kilohertz frequency radio bursts that come and go with a 45-minute period, as did the Ulysses spacecraft when it flew by Jupiter in 1990. That come and go with a 45-minute period, as did the Ulysses spacecraft when it flew by Jupiter in 1992. So this is important because it shows it's not just the Chandra X-ray telescope, it's also Galileo and it's also Ulysses. And they're also telling you it's not just X-rays, it's also radio wave frequencies on other levels besides the X-ray band. Different satellites are picking it up. It's got this very regular, mysterious 45-minute cycle. So then the key is going to become, okay, well, how long does it take Jupiter to rotate so that then we can figure out what that 45 minutes is? What's the division of Jupiter's rotation that 45 minutes represents? We're going to get to that in a minute. Let's keep reading. Maybe Jupiter's magnetic field, when it gets hit by a solar wind gust, rings like a bell with a 45-minute period, speculates Gladstone. Okay, but look, just because the solar wind is hitting Jupiter, why would it ring every 45 minutes? There's no conventional model to explain why it would take 45 minutes, why you wouldn't get anything in between the 45 minutes, nor does it explain why it happens at the North Pole. But this just shows the type of speculation that these guys have to do, because they're just reaching out. They're trying to find some way to explain this, but they really don't get it. Let's continue. Every 45 minutes, an X-ray source blinks near Jupiter's north magnetic pole. This animation, based on data from the Chandra X-ray Observatory, shows the hotspot pulsing exactly 15 times during one complete 10-hour rotation of the giant planet. Yes. Now we've got it. The planet takes 10 hours to rotate. You chop 10 hours up into 45, and you get 15 of them exactly. 15 sounds pretty darn geometric to me. It sounds like there's something cooking. So before we get into the math, which is very, very simple, okay, third grade, nothing more than that, we're going to show you once again what this thing looks like. Let's take a look. So you can see that all of these flashes, of course, what we're seeing is Jupiter is rotating. We now know that that rotation takes 10 hours, and there are going to be 15 of these blasts every rotation. The blasts are almost always in the exact same area, which is right where the tip of the tetrahedron would be. So the question I'm asking myself is, could this be geometric? It didn't take very long of me trying to figure out, okay, the planet rotates and there's 15. To try to get to the bottom of this, it was actually pretty fast. So I start to imagine counter-rotating geometries. Let's go to the slides now. Counter-rotating geometries, one of them being 3 points equidistant along the middle of the equator there, which is your tetrahedron, so you got your 3. And then this one, of course, comes out to 5, because you have a pentagon. So let's see what happens if you multiply the 3 corners of the tetrahedron by the 5 corners of the pentagon. Well, sure enough, 3 times 5 equals 15. Is this just some numerology? Heck no. What I'm saying is you have 3 corners of the tetrahedron that are colliding with 5 corners of the pentagon. They're counter-rotating. There's a total of 15 collisions for each planetary revolution, which is 10 hours. So exactly 15 collisions. The nodes cross, boom, it's like something goes off. You're touching off an explosive, in a sense. They're arcing out. There's strong charge. Remember when I showed you Jupiter? And we set line all this ionized oxygen that has this greenish glow that's visible on the night side of the planet. Yes, this geometry is very, very energized. It's got plasma. It's got enormous power, so much so that when the geometry crosses a total of 15 times, as the planet spins, boom, you get this gigawatt explosion coming off the top of the planet. If you could harness that as an energy source, it would solve all your energy needs, no question. And it's right there. It's this weird geometric thing, and nobody else had ever talked about this being geometric. This is one of the things that I figured out on my own, and I'm proud of myself for it. But there's been a lot of these. You start to think about this stuff, you start to understand what's really going on, and things just kind of pop out, and you're like, oh my God, look at that. And that's not the only one. There was another example that's also very, very cool. So it's the top of the thing right again. So just in case, I'm zooming in even more now, you can really see, boom, there's the tetrahedron. You actually see the geometry of the top. It's amazing. Now another one that Hoagland did talk about, which isn't really a colliding geometry, but it is a polar geometry, is the hexagon of Saturn. Right at the pole, take a look at this. You look at the North Pole, and sure enough, there is a hexagon. Now, what probably is going on here is that there is the North Pole of a tetrahedron, but then at the North Pole, where the node is, there is a smaller sphere, and it fractalizes into a smaller Merkaba. So there's a Merkaba on the corner of each larger Merkaba. So like you have one big Merkaba, and on the corners you have smaller spheres, and there's a Merkaba inside the spheres, each one of them. So because the tetrahedron has 4 points, and then the Merkabas all along those points. On the North Pole, you're seeing the cross-section of that Merkaba. Because remember, there's 2 tetrahedrons, so you're not going to get a triangle, you're going to get a hexagon in the middle. You cut it right in half. That Merkaba is sitting right there on the North Pole of Saturn. There's its hexagon, and it has been there this whole time. It is an incredibly persistent formation. The earliest photos we've ever had show that it has always been there. It's hiding out in the open. Secrets of this geometry right there. And then we see Saturn's moon Titan has another very strange 19.5 degree heat upwelling. Let's take a look. This is one from Richard Hoagland once again, and it says the bright spot is an infrared image from a telescope in Hawaii, and it could be a giant mountain near the equator. No, it's not a mountain. It's actually a hyperdimensional upwelling. And I believe actually this is one of the ones that I found and then stuck into the Interplanetary Day After Tomorrow paper that Hoagland and I co-authored. And he was very happy when I found this one as well, because you look at it, there's no denying. It's right there at the 19.5. And this is the largest moon of Saturn. Let's keep going. Neptune has the great dark spot. We talked about that in the previous episode. But what we did not talk about, I might have only alluded to it, is that NASA confirmed that Neptune's great dark spot had a hyperdimensional pole shift. And this is one of the things that the Russian scientist we're going to meet soon, Dr. Alexei Dmitriev, talked about in his paper, a very important paper. The great dark spot just suddenly jumped from 19.5 degrees south to 19.5 degrees north. And NASA has no explanation for this. Take a look. Here it is when it was sitting there at the south in its original position and observed for many, many years with all their telescopes and everything. Now, unfortunately, you cannot see it with the naked eye here, but this is the photograph from which their very intense scientific measurements using all these elaborate things that are outside the visible spectrum, they were able to see with this that the great dark spot migrated from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere, but it maintained the 19.5 degree latitude, and this happened all of a sudden between June 1994 and March 1995, less than a year. It just up and moves. Now, how could that happen? What I'm saying is, you have a Merkaba here, and it's got its own angles relevant to other planets and relevant to the sun. So as the planet tilts on its axis over time, there's going to be new activation, geometry from the sun, energetic fields from the sun collide with the planet and activate the opposite tetrahedron, and now all of a sudden this vortex just jumps. And again, you can research this. It's in my book, Source Field Investigations, with the links to the scientific studies. I didn't take the time to put every single one of these into this slideshow, but you get the point. These are the pictures. You can research it in my book. It is absolutely a real thing that happened. And as you see here, this was taken from the official Hubble Space Telescope website, curated by Dr. Heidi Hammel, the hyperdimensional pole shift. And then in 1998, they talk about a looming mystery, which is that the great dark spot now appears fixed at the northern latitude. Remember, they don't understand the tetrahedral model. So when they see it suddenly jump from south to north, they expect it's going to keep on moving around. But no, it just goes to the north, and then it sits there. And now it's just comfortable in the north. So this is now 3 years after 1990, and now it's just comfortable in the north. So this is now 3 years after 1995, and they're throwing their hands up going, well, we have no idea why this is sitting in one place, but it is. They don't understand it. And as you can see here, this is from Dr. Lawrence Stromovsky, who is from University of Wisconsin-Madison on the NASA's Hubble site. So he's the guy that wrote up this study. If you want to look for it yourself, just Google him up and type in looming mystery, great dark spot Neptune, and you'll easily find it. So now we're going to look at the final example for this episode of geometry and collision. So what we're going to see in this image of the solar system is the heliosphere, this magnetic field, is getting charged on the front end. And that is the collision of our solar system with the geometry of this big domain wall that is expanding away from the galaxy and from other emitters that are closer at hand. Finally, in 2009, NASA admitted this to us. And this all gets back to what we've been talking about. Is there an etheric energy zone now expanding into our solar system? And if so, what is it going to do and when? And more importantly, as we'll get into in later episodes, how do we prepare for it? This is, of course, the esoteric aspect where we have a conscious living universe, and this is much more of a spiritual event than just a physical so-called catastrophe. Don't look at it as catastrophic, look at it as a multidimensional activation. Now let's get into the study. Only in December 2009 did NASA finally admit that we are heading into a highly magnetic cloud outside our solar system, and this is where they did it. It was December 23rd, 2009, just before Christmas. Voyager makes an interstellar discovery. Isn't it interesting? It's right around the solstice time that they published this. And you can clearly see this is a NASA website. And it says right there, the very first sentence, the solar system is passing through an interstellar cloud that physics says should not exist. And it says right there, the very first sentence, the solar system is passing through an interstellar cloud that physics says should not exist. And that's the link. You can go look it up yourself if you want to check this out on your own. And then this is a little bit lower. I'm now just zooming in on another part of the article so you can see a little more of it. And the top story's on the right. And then it says right there, using data from Voyager, we have discovered a strong magnetic field just outside the solar system, explains the lead author, Merav Ofer, a NASA heliophysics guest investigator from George Mason University. This magnetic field holds the interstellar cloud together and solves the long-standing puzzle of how it can exist at all. So here is Dr. Merav Ofer, and it's nice for once to actually see a woman getting involved in making huge scientific breakthroughs. Now, it's not just her picture that's interesting because she is a woman, it's also, look at what's behind her. On her computer monitor, there she has an image of our solar system moving into a cloud of energy, a very bright cloud. This is a NASA diagram, and you see at the very bottom there's a yellow word heliosphere right above where her computer's pop-ups are, and there's a big yellow arrow into the body of the heliosphere. Then you see there's a blue sphere around the sun, and that's called the termination shock. Then you see Voyager 1, Voyager 2 at the edges of the blue sphere. Then you have the helio sheath up at the top, the heliopause, and then the bow shock. And this is the paper that she actually got published in Nature Science Journal called A Strong, Highly Tilted Interstellar Magnetic Field Near the Solar System. In the next episode, we're going to come back to Dr. Merav Ofer. It's very nice to see a woman making breakthroughs like this, and what she did is to totally set up our entire discussion of interplanetary climate change, proving one of the most important points, which is that there is a cloud, it's very, very energetic, and that energy is going to do a lot. 1997 by a Russian physicist named Dr. Alexei Dmitriev. That's coming up next time here on Wisdom Teachings, Interplanetary Climate Change. I'm David Wilcock, and I want to thank you for watching.